Hey there, everyone. Greetings. Welcome here to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So we're here to do the episode of Commonalities Compared. This is an episode I put out in the evening every Sunday, in which I talk about some rock commonality. It could be to bands, it could be to albums, could be to producers, could be to guitarists, anything that has some commonality. This will be the first of this type of topic today. We're doing a comparison or a discussion about hard rock versus progressive rock, or hard rock and progressive rock. I try not to use the word combatant here because it's not really a competition. So anyways, the two genres, hard rock and progressive rock, I believe hard rock kind of started, towards the end of the late 60s. Well, just about everything started towards the end of the late 60s. So up until that point, you kind of had your rock and roll. Most of the music was love-themed, dominated. The old sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing was going full blast, probably into the mid-60s, and then out of that, some bands started to develop a different style. So I think with the progressive rock element, kind of started out with Floyd and the Beatles probably being the first to do it, and some other bands, Jefferson Airplane and all these, started moving into this psychedelic music. The Beatles kind of leading the way on that, and the psychedelic music began to change into, well, not all of it, but some of it began to change into this progressive movement, which started in the late 60s and early 70s with bands such as Yes and the Moody Blues and a few other bands like that, Genesis. That began, and ELP, of course, can't forget them. They are probably one of the primary ones, giant bands at the time. And this progressive movement came out of that. The hard rock movement started roughly the same kind of time frame. You started getting people like Hendrix playing really heavy stuff and Cream playing really heavy stuff. And then this morphed as the 70s came into play, and then you got bands like Alice Cooper and Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin and Kiss and all kinds of bands playing this hard stuff, some of them almost to the realm of metal, or proto-metal if you prefer. But this, to me, is when they kind of both came around the same time. I like them both a lot. These are my two favorite. I'm just going to pull this down a little because I feel like I'm looking up at the ceiling. But anyways, so these are my two forms of music that I enjoy the most. Initially, I was probably more into the hard rock. Being younger and all that, I liked that aggressive feeling. And I wasn't paying as much attention to the lyrics. I just liked the heavy riffing and the guitars and the pounding drums and all that stuff that goes with hard rock. And just that energy that comes from it. The progressive stuff didn't come too much later for me, but it was going on at the same time. I just didn't get into it much later until it was in the 80s. Once I got to the end of my teens in the early 80s, or the beginning of the 80s, I started wanting more complexity in the music, more, I wouldn't say more sophistication. I don't think it's more sophisticated, although it might be. I think it was more that it was more complex. It was almost fantasy realm, which is where I wanted to be. I liked it was escapism for me. That's where progressive rock started for me and why it started. Whereas the hard rock was just, I wanted to be part of. I liked the high energy. I liked the fist pumping. I liked all that stuff that went with hard rock. Progressive rock, not so much that, but more of the complexity. As my mind started to expand, I wanted more substance to it, I guess is probably what it was. And so eventually progressive rock became the mantra for me, although after a lot of the progressive bands of the 70s became pop bands of the 80s, I was disenchanted with the entire movement and just kind of went away from it and went completely a different direction. Started getting into blues rock and other stuff like that, rhythm and blues and that kind of stuff, metal, a little bit more into the metal realm. So those things kind of took me away from hard rock and progressive rock. But always I liked them. So the stuff that I had listened to from before, the 80s, the 70s stuff for the progressive rock and the 70s stuff for the for the hard rock, I still was listening to. I still had that as part of my collection. And then probably sometime in the 90s, I began to move back towards these two types of music. As bands began to move back towards these, and Rush was one of the bands started going back to this realm. Yes, started going towards this realm more. And Jethro Tull had some stuff out as well. So I started moving towards the progressive movement again and the hard rock movement. To me, they just kind of always kind of flowed together. I moved away from them around the same time, and then I moved back around the same time. And for me, the biggest, the hard rock bands that probably dominate it for me are the ones that still kind of think of themselves as rock and roll bands, like Kiss and AC/DC, and I'm trying to think of some others. And then you have the bands that were kind of proto-metal, but also had the hard rock in their elements. Bands like Thin Lizzy and Triumph and Rush and those type of bands. But then you had the progressive bands, the original big bands, and then you had this neo-prog movement. That probably was the one that that made me realize that progressive music may not have been dead. I mean, you can only, the problem with progressive rock is it expands to a certain place. There's no place else to go. So a lot of people feel it's dead now, and this stuff is just prog. And that might be true. I'm not going to argue with it, but some of that prog is really good, so that's why I still do it. So the neo-prog movement started, but I still didn't really get into it until I came back full force after my daughter's birth and started listening to Jethro Tull and Genesis and all these bands that I hadn't really followed much early on. And then, of course, now we're listening to all kinds of different stuff. If you told me 5 years ago that there was more than a dozen progressive rock bands, I would have thought you didn't know what you're talking about. Because I could count on both hands the number of bands I thought were progressive, and I didn't think there was any beyond that. Obviously, I'm completely wrong. There are hundreds of progressive rock bands out there. There's it's endless. Like, you can't even keep up with it. That's how many there are. So for me, those are the two genres that I got into and why I got into them and why I still listen to them and why they're probably still my two favorite genres. Although I have developed interest in metal. Metal is very close to being part of that group. And then you've got folk music, folk rock, you've got psychedelic rock, and a little bit of blues stuff that I also like quite a bit too. I haven't really taken the jazz or the jazz fusion thing on. That might come later. But anyways, that's the show for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Commonalities Compared. I thank Ben for the topic. I thank you for coming and watching. Please hit the like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episode. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss next week's episode. And if you have any comments about anything I've said or anything about either of these two genres, you can put them in the comment section below, and we will be back next Sunday with another episode of Commonalities Compared. So take care and have yourself a good evening.